It's July 29th, 1954, and another remarkable event is about to be uncovered by Ariel, Rebecca, and Ali, the Retrospectors.
So it was today in history in 3018 that Gandalf was held captive by Saruman on the pinnacle of Orthanc, that Boromir travelled towards Rivendell to ask for counsel, and of course also today in history in 3019, the year later, that the funeral procession of King Theoden travelled across Edoras. But back on Earth, we only know these things because today in actual real-life history in 1954, the world first read J.R.R. Tolkien's fantasy novel, The Fellowship of the Ring.
Yeah, and when those very first copies of The Fellowship of the Ring were placed onto bookstore shelves, there were no midnight lines, obviously, no promotional posters, and none of the fanfare that came with the movie versions of this amazing epic. But visitors to London bookshops that morning would have been still bearing the literal and economic scars of World War II, with food rationing having only just ended across Britain a few weeks before. And so, you know, this book arrived at a hefty 21 shillings on a quiet Thursday morning with a kind of readership that wasn't necessarily ready to pick it up. For anyone who did pick up the book, you'd open up the pages and be greeted by an incredibly detailed hand-drawn map of an imaginary land called Middle-earth folded into the back cover. And it was a demanding and dense and kind of physically quite peculiar package that stood completely apart from the standard post-war literary landscape.
Yeah, and Tolkien's publishers, Allen and Unwin, were also feeling the pinch of austerity Britain because they were the ones who suggested that the book, which Tolkien originally envisioned as a single volume, be divided into 3 parts, particularly because they were trying to hedge their bets financially. They weren't too sure how this sprawling, intricate novel was going to sell, so it was safer to publish this first volume, Fellowship of the Ring, and see how that went, then print the second and the third with a better idea of what the demand would be. This was actually reflected in the deal they cut with Tolkien too. He wouldn't receive a penny until sales broke even, but then he was guaranteed a very generous cut of the profits it made from there. And the publication was delayed by the time it took to compile and typeset all the maps and appendices that Tolkien considered indispensable elements. So it was quite an elaborate production for its time. And Allen and Unwin, they really wanted him to write it because The Hobbit, which had been released, at this point 17 years earlier, had been a huge success. But when he started writing it and it became clear that it was going to be aimed more for an adult reader audience than The Hobbit, which had been very much a children's book, I think they started to sort of have a bit of, a little bit of hesitation, thinking, is it going to have that same level of success? By the time it came to market, it'd been 17 years since The Hobbit. The children who had loved that book had grown up and probably some of them had children of their own.
Yeah, well, one of those children was Rayner Unwin, who was the son of Stanley Unwin of the publishers Allen and Unwin. It was Rayner, aged 10, who had been the sample reader of the Hobbit manuscript. Stanley had come home with the manuscript. He had a great belief of, if I'm going to publish kids' books, I should test them on kids. And he paid Rayner 1 shilling to write a book report on The Hobbit. And he basically said, this is great, children around the world will love this. And he was like, good enough for me, let's publish it. So when it came to The Lord of the Rings, he again gave the manuscript to Rayner, although Rayner by this stage was 27 and worked for him, and said, what do you think now? And it was Rayner who championed it and said, yes, it's a masterpiece. Don't worry that you think it's going to lose you money. Don't worry that part 1 is 400 pages long. Don't worry that it's taken him 17 years to write the sequel. Just publish it, trust me. And if he hadn't had that champion, it seems kind of crazy to imagine now when you see what is being published on this day and all the concepts and the words that we're so familiar with, the whole genre of modern fantasy. But, it sort of hinged on a few champions in the publishing company to say, yeah, honestly, it's good, I promise, because there hadn't been a genre piece like this.
Yeah, and in fact, Tolkien was also benefiting from the encouragement of the Inklings, which were the informal Oxford literary group that included C.S. Lewis, and they used to meet at the Eagle and Child pub and also at Lewis's rooms in Magdalen College. And they gave Tolkien a forum to share his very gradually developing work. Lewis was among those who heard Tolkien read sections aloud, and he was really enthusiastic about it. And his encouragement is often said to be the thing that brought Tolkien to actually manage to finish the thing, but I think that's a little bit overstated. But even so, Tolkien was often really frustrated by the scale and the complexity of this huge project that he'd got himself into after all. But still, he came up against the fact that by the time he turned in this massive, hefty tome, his publishers were like, this is a disaster.
And Lewis was like, I told you should have had a lion that was Jesus.
Yeah. But no, that decision then to separate the book out into the Fellowship of the Ring, the Two Towers, and the Return of the King was practical and economic. But it was also, a reflection of the fact that Tolkien had got so into this thing that he had woven whole worlds, created whole languages, and this was what he was delivering on this day.
Yeah, and literary critics have actually noted that Fellowship of the Ring has quite a unique structure and one that differs from subsequent parts of the trilogy, which take place after the breakup of the original Fellowship. So they have a slightly more complex narrative that leaps around in time, and it's going between different protagonists, different storylines. But the Fellowship focuses entirely on Frodo's journey, apart from 2 flashback chapters. And it follows like a very repetitive rhythmic format of, confrontation with danger, taking refuge in a cozy house, go to the next place, confrontation with danger, refuge in a cozy house, etc., etc., which I think goes some way to explaining why the book holds such a deep place in the hearts of many readers. It's that reassuring rhythm of peril and safety. But for some, it reads as not a lack of inspiration, obviously, because the book is just brimming over with creativity and ideas, but maybe like the wider narrative thrust. And instead, it's got this episodic format that dwells on details. It's been compared to the picaresque novels of the 16th century, which was just sort of episodic wanderings of a protagonist with no real overarching plot. There's scenes of hobbits chatting and singing, but a lot of scenes are food related, which I think is really interesting, because this is the end, as you were saying, the end of post-war austerity, food rationing, and you see it in other authors of the 1950s, like Enid Blyton, like Ian Fleming. When we talked about James Bond, and when you read the books, a lot of copy is devoted to what is James Bond eating. So there is really that sort of that comfort side, which I think is why people want to live in this world that Tolkien created. But it was a risk because he put so much into it. He was gambling everything on the fact that the reader would also want to spend time immersed in that world before the plot starts to really grind into gear in the second and third parts of the trilogy and pick up a bit more momentum.
I suppose, though, partly that familiarity is because it comes from English written and oral tradition. Even if you don't know those stories, it is sort of part of the folkloric sense of the English countryside with Hobbiton and all that, but also the quest, which is because, just to be clear, we talked about Tolkien being in Oxford, but he was an Oxford Don. He was a professor. He was a highly regarded expert on medieval writing. And his response to reading Middle English was not to think like everyone else around him, oh, I'd like to write an essay about that one. But instead, I'd like to write a modern version of that. And, the prompt was one line of poetry from Old English that he came across in Christ of Cinewolf. Quote, "Hail Arundel, brightest of angels, above the Middle Earth sent unto men." And he was like, oh, Middle Earth, eh? Tell me more. And so in a strange sort of way, like the whole Lord of the Rings saga started as like Cinewolf fanfic. But it's because that was his day job. This was his side hustle. And he was already immersed in a world of language and approach to the stories that he was reading that was a bit like what he was going to write. He just wanted to write a new version of it.
And I wonder if something of the precision of him being an academic was what so divided critics in the early days, because, it was both lauded as this incredible achievement of imagination and myth-making and all of that. But there was this undercurrent of criticism from people who were saying that it was just escapist fantasy that really wasn't worthy of anyone's serious attention. You had the defenders like W.H. Auden, the poet, who had this very enthusiastic review in the New York Times book review section. And he wrote that no other imaginary world that he had ever encountered in recent fiction had given him such pleasure, and basically argued that Tolkien had achieved something extraordinary. But then you had critics like the American critic Edmund Wilson, who published his famous early attack in an essay that was called Ooh, Those Awful Orcs, that really did just dismiss the whole thing as a childish fantasy, but he also ridiculed people who were trying to defend it.
One of the things that Wilson called out, something that sort of we alluded to earlier, the fact that the author has, quote, indulged himself in developing the fantasy for its own sake. And that was strangely something that Tolkien almost seemed to agree with, because in a 1955 letter he wrote, "The stories were made rather to provide a world for the languages than the reverse. Certainly it has no allegorical intentions, general, particular or topical, moral, religious or political." I mean, obviously lots of people would disagree and have seen those messages in his writing, but he was very clear that his creative impulse was driven by his love of what he called glossopoeia, meaning inventing languages, and mythopoeia, inventing mythology. He hovered over the translations. He wanted to see them all personally. He spoke and read a lot of languages, and so he would want to see the translations, and he would provide detailed feedback, questions, criticisms to the translators. In fact, in 1967, he wrote a pamphlet for translators of his work called Guide to the Names in the Lord of the Rings, where he goes into the etymology behind them and suggests if and how those could be reflected in other languages.
This initial print run of 3,000 copies that came out today, priced at 21 shillings, if you've got one in your library, it's now worth up to £10,000, and you can tell if you've got a first edition by turning to page 424. If Frodo is spelt correctly, F-R-O-D-O, then that's an original. In the later runs, there was a mistake where it's printed as Fodo. So that's how you know.
So if you find it, you are allowed to whisper under your breath, "My precious."
Yeah.
Subscribe on Apple Podcasts or Patreon to hear bonus material from Arian, Rebecca, and Ali, the Retrospectors.